Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining this timely conversation. Please do share your questions and comments via the chat on the right side of your screen. And when you do so, also include your first name and city where you're watching from. I'm your host, Puja Gupta Senning. I'm a woman, mother, psychotherapist, Indian American, and Vermonter. Let's meet our awesome panelists. Coco and then Paul, will you please introduce yourselves?
Of course. Thanks so much for having us. So yes, my given name is Courtney. I also go by Coco. I use she and they pronouns. I'm a cisgender, queer, Indian American woman, femme, daughter, friend, training psychotherapist, social worker, and lifelong student. So it's really nice to be here. And I've been here in Vermont now for a little over 10 years. So feels timely indeed.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Paul, he, him, his pronouns. I live in Essex Junction, Vermont, and I've been here for just about 8 years now. We'll spend a lot more time talking about this, but I'm a husband, I'm a father of 2 wonderful children. I work at the University of Vermont, and I'm also a consultant with a company called CQ Strategies. And I'm really just thrilled and excited to be here. Thank you again for this opportunity to just be able to talk about the Asian American experience in Vermont with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So both of you have really long histories of standing up for people of the global majority. And I'm so curious, this is a demanding field. It's a field that you feel it in your bones. You're not in it for like the money. You're in it because it matters to you. And I'm so curious, what got you into this field of work? I guess let's go with you, Paul, first.
So I had the opportunity as an undergraduate to take a course titled The History and Development of Racism in the United States of America. And this was during the fall semester of my sophomore year. And these 2 incredible teachers, professors, white men taught it. One named Horace Seldon and another named Paul Marcus, both of whom were active anti-racist and had been for decades. They really helped me as that young man really begin to learn the truth about our country's history, about the history of Asian Americans in the country, and really helped me start to reconcile what I thought I understood about our country and what they and now I feel like our country could be in the future. And I actually ended up going back to that course 8 more times, 3 as an undergraduate teaching assistant, and then I actually co-taught it with Paul Marcus for 5 semesters after I graduated from college as well. And during those 9 semesters of experiencing that course with literally hundreds and hundreds of undergraduates, that really, again, got me into this field. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more later as well, but really helped me to understand where my strengths lie and how I've chosen my career path and where I've, again, chosen to spend my time and energy. So that's kind of all of that in a nutshell, but I'll pass things over to Coco here to tell her story.
Yeah, I love that. I can't believe you taught that for so long after too. You love that course. Yeah, for me, I mean, yeah, I love this question, Pooja, because I feel like I really didn't have a choice, right? Like my whole life has been racialized. So, my earliest childhood school memories were just feeling like I didn't belong, like there wasn't a space for me, whether it was the clothes I was wearing or the way that I smelled, because I'd come from, a home full of cooking, whether it was the food that I brought, or whether it was like my morals or the way that I even just spoke and moved through the world. I remember just experiencing a lot of bullying in middle school and high school, specifically related to my race. And then I got to college and it moved to a place of like fetishization and pedestaling in college. Then moving into the workplace, experiencing a lot of gaslighting. And then just also like observing my own harm and my own complicity in some of these systems. So I just started to realize pretty early on, like I didn't want this life for my family, for my children, if I were to ever have children or a family of my own, and then also I wouldn't I have to honor my parents in a lot of ways too here, because, my parents were both immigrants. They're also my heroes, in addition to being a large source of my trauma. And I'm speaking broadly, this wasn't everyone's experience, but there is like this punishable expectation of silence and submission in South Asian culture in general. And it's not a coincidence that my given name, Courtney, is highly westernized and associated with whiteness. My parents did everything they thought that they could to protect me from being seen as an outsider and as a foreigner. So their desperation to assimilate comes from their own racialized trauma and anxiety and depression. They didn't want me to have to work as hard as they did to be seen as a human being. So the more of our culture that they intentionally and unintentionally stripped from our lives, the more lost I became at times. So never really Indian enough for our Indian community, but never American enough for the white community. And what I really needed back then was another queer Indian American femme to see me, right? To really see me and to tell me that my skin was beautiful, that my favorite foods had been the same favorite foods of hundreds of millions of people for centuries, and that my sadness made sense, that my anger was righteous, and that I belonged here. So, that I deserved to take up space, and that there were so many others like me, and that I would one day find my people if I could find the courage to step onto that path of self-discovery and off the yellow brick road that I was kind of conditioned to walk. So that's how I got here.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And thank you for the depth of that. I really appreciated hearing your personal stories. I mean, this work really is so personal. I think about living here in Vermont, an incredibly white state, and just that feeling of, when I walk into a store, when I'm with clients, the feeling of the white gaze on my system, on my neurons. Like, I am aware that other people are viewing me at any given point in time. And it may be neutral energy, or it might even be curiosity and positive. Really, it might even be positive. But the bottom line is, whether it's, forget even negative, but even if it's just curiosity and positive, there's a sense of like, I am an event. I am, I'm an animal in a zoo. Coco, you mentioned that, and I appreciated that sense of being viewed and as an object, even if it's a neutral or positive energy. And it's so rare. It's so rare to be in the presence of other folks who are also non-white Vermonters, who can relate and who can kind of understand what it is that I'm talking about there. So curious about your experiences with this, if you can relate, if you have that understanding that I'm kind of digging into.
Go ahead, Paul.
Either of you can go for it, please.
I'll share a couple of different things. So when I moved here to Vermont 8 years ago, I came to be a school-based administrator in South Burlington, Vermont. I believe I was hired as the first administrator of color in that storied district's entire history. When I, for example, attended the Vermont Principals Association's annual conference each summer, I was keenly aware that I believe at the time I was, I think, one of literally 3 or 4 administrators of color in this entire state. And I'm not just talking about principals, I'm talking about principals, assistant principals, curriculum coordinators, special education administrators, superintendents, etc. So in that regard, I was a spectacle, right, to I think a large degree. And I think part of the daily calculus that goes into interactions or experiences like that is the wondering of, are people thinking on the other side, is this guy going to speak with an accent? Where is he really from? All of those, right, I think things come up for me. I think the other side of it is that I have a white partner. I have 2 children who are ethnically, right, half Korean and half white. And I think that, to a large degree, we try to navigate spaces as quote unquote normally as possible, but also understand that for some people, right, that's, worthy of a second glance or worthy of a closer kind of look or something to that effect. And I'll just use my wife quickly as an example. Her name is Jenny Yoon. And she's even had experiences where doctors would come to see her, and they would do that. And they would be like, wait, you're Jenny Yoon, but you're white. And she would have to go through and explain the story of why her surname obviously is Yoon now. And just kind of experiencing that, right? Disright connect there. I could go on and share other, I think, experiences, but I'll let Coco again share their experiences as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing your story. I think honestly, you're both touching on so much, and a lot of my experiences are similar. That kind of metaphor of being an animal in a zoo is really the most salient for me, because like you said, Puja, it's not always when people are looking at you and they're angry. Like if you can imagine seeing like a beautiful, majestic animal right behind the glass, sometimes people kind of press their face up and they're like, wow, in the wild, or look at it in action, or so close, up close and personal. And that's been sort of my experience in Vermont in a lot of ways. And then, you know, the flip side to that coin is I can't even count at this point how many times someone has yelled at me to go back to my country or thrown things at me. Just a few instances, even in this past year, you know, in Essex and in Winooski, South Burlington. And so when I think about this place that's our home, right, like this is my home, I think about when people say things like that, when they recognize you, right, not as a human being, but like as an outsider, as an object, as an intruder. And to be told that we're intruders in our own homes, it's like, get a new saying. Come on, get something original, because we've been hearing that for so long as well. But what happens when you really start to root and ground in a place and it really becomes your home? I think what it's done for me is it's just ignited this feeling of sense of place and sense of belonging. And so now when I hear things like that, or when people are staring, or when people ask me strange questions, I'm a little bit less fazed than I used to be, because I think for myself, I'm like, I do belong here though. I know my community's here. I know my people are here. I know this is my home. You can't drive that wedge for me right now, right? So yeah, I can definitely relate. And I think my relationship to being noticed has changed.
Yeah, you know, and I think that just even living as people of the global majority, living in rural white areas, that is revolutionary.
Yeah.
Right? Because so many Vermonters, they just don't see people who are not white. And it's no fault of anybody's. It's just the reality of living in a white state. And so by being, I think about the revolutionary act of just being and shining, and, you know, whatever you're into, being into that and being comfortable with that as being so life-changing for people. We have a comment from one of our viewers. They say, this is the history we all need to know and absorb so that we can move forward together and not be divided by a false narrative. We are much stronger when we are united. So we appreciate that, viewer. Thank you so much. Actually, this is a great segue, Coco. I was wondering, I wanted to ask you if you could help me understand, how do you conceptualize the intersection between the movement for and the fight for Black lives with the fight for Asian American rights and visibility?
Yeah, of course. It's a really important question. And I think something that our community really needs to start to understand and dig into. So you know, one of the things I really like to talk about with people is that Asians were not, you know, we weren't violently taken and enslaved as our African siblings were. And at the same time, breaking ground makes it very clear that we actually need to reframe this idea that Asians excitedly and peacefully immigrated to this land. Asians were brought to this country by other more covert ways of force, such as physical protection, opportunity to sustain family, and supposed political freedom. So that's not even getting into things like the Indian system of indentured servitude, right? More than 1 million Indians were extracted from their homeland to labor in European colonies, such as the Caribbean, on plantations as a substitute for slave labor indirect response to the so-called, labor shortage after slave emancipation between 1838 and 1917. So here's a reality. We were brought here, right? Our earliest ancestors didn't come looking for an American dream. They were lured here on false promises, manipulated, and positioned from the start to be slightly better than Black people. And so without an elevated consciousness, that legacy lives on in our communities. I just want to take a second to really feel that. And we also can't talk about racial tensions between the Black and Asian communities without critically analyzing what happened in the brutalizing of Rodney King, the murder of 15-year-old Latasha Harlins, and the subsequent burning and looting of Koreatown in 1992, which is the year I was actually born. And how all of these things actually bolster white supremacy rather than fleshing out any deeper understanding of the relationship between our communities. Because despite the Black community in LA being terrorized by the police and the Korean community in LA being entirely unprotected by the police, so a conscious effort by white-bodied people and the police force to allow the systematic or consequential extermination of both Black and Asian people, the narrative fixated on rising tensions between Blacks and Asians. And that's on purpose, right? Like that's on purpose. We have to really grapple with that. That is the distraction. It's also the reason that the media is now sharing more footage of Black perpetrators of violent hate crimes against Asian people, rather than underscoring the nearly 75% of these crimes that are being committed by white assailants. This is because our predominantly white media protects white-bodied people and hangs people of color, particularly Black people, out to dry. And that's why the Black and Asian struggle is intertwined, right? Like historical narratives are, they're different pieces of information stitched together in productive ways, but always from the positionality of who is in power, who is actually creating that narrative. So that stitching together is not an objective truth. If the common denominator in this equation is white supremacy, and it always has been, we have to question how these narratives are being created and for what purpose.
Awesome. Thank you, Coco. Paul, did you want to add? Yeah, please.
I did want to just add one piece, and I think that there is a long history of what Coco is talking about, dating, all the way back to the 17th century and the 18th century, with responses or reactions, right, to things like Nathan's Rebellion and, Bacon's Rebellion. My apologies. And again, this backlash, right, against this cross-right coalition of peoples, white, right, Black, some free, some indentured, right, aristocratic, if you will, and the quote-unquote peasant classes all coming together to fight for their collective, right, liberation. And again, we see this very intentional, right, systematic elimination of rights and the codification of laws that, right, diminish the ability, right, for groups of people like that to be able to come together again. And we see, right, coincidentally, right, the creation, literal creation, right, of the concept of whiteness to continue, right, to wedge, people, right, from one another. And so again, I'm just saying that there's been a long history of this. And I think that part of what the group that I'm a part of and that we're a part of, Vermont APIDA for Black Lives, is trying to continue to communicate to people is that we're not going to allow that, right, to happen to us. We're not going to be, right, used as pawns to continue, right, to put a wedge between us and our Black friends and neighbors and colleagues and other, again, historically and structurally marginalized communities as well. Because as the commenter, right, and the viewer has already said, we know that if we combine our forces, we are going to be that much stronger, despite, right, what that kind of media narrative or part of the media narrative might be out there.
Yeah. Can I add something?
Yeah.
Can we just talk about 9/11 real quick? Because, I love that Hari Kondabolu actually shares in this episode the idea that South Asians were victimized twice, right? After 9/11. So, he says first, as Americans, we were victimized by the terrorist attacks. And then second, we were blamed for the acts of terrorism. And so I want to just touch on the Patriot Act, because with the Patriot Act, the US weaponized 9/11, not just against brown people, but immigrants as a whole. So this is where the country pivoted from citizenship paths to surveillance, secrecy, deportation, and government-sanctioned racial profiling in the name of security. So 9/11 changed my life. And I was so scared to say that because I knew the risk that I ran if I were to say, like, this feels like overkill. No, is it just me? So this was a moment where to contest surveillance at that time was to display a lack of patriotism, which automatically meant that you were dangerous. So to dismiss how 9/11 and everything that followed further entrenched a culture of deafening silence in the South Asian community is a grave oversight of our collective trauma. Right? Like, we can't effectively join in the fight for Black lives until we acknowledge and heal this part of our story. And until that part of our story is also validated and held compassionately by people outside of our community.
Wonderful. Thank you, Coco and Paul. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, Paul, into what you do professionally. I'm so curious where the challenges are, where you find hope. Yeah, if you could tell us about that.
Yeah, so I'll kind of illuminate just a couple of the different hats that I wear. So on one kind of side, I work as senior advisor for strategic diversity assessment and research at the University of Vermont. And I support the vice provost for diversity, equity, and inclusion there. And what that affords me is the opportunity to collaborate with this person on a number of issues that touch upon many different aspects of the university's operations. And part of that really is, how do we get the university community, all of our colleges, all of our faculty, our staff and students, really, again, thinking deeply about these issues of equity, and how do we, again, as a very old institution, play our part in helping to really address, right, systemic racism, again, as, right, this quote unquote flagship university here in the state. The other hat that I'll just quickly mention is that I'm also a partner with a small consultancy called CQ Strategies. And we have the wonderful opportunity to be able to support a wide variety of organizations with their own either JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion kind of efforts, or some just call them their DEI efforts, their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And again, we've had the opportunity to work literally with hundreds of different organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, small, governmental, et cetera. And again, in a myriad of different ways to really support their growth and their, again, efforts in this space. So a couple of things that I wanted to just share in terms of what both kind of are some of the challenges and some of the hope. So in terms of the challenges, I think one of the things that is a perennial kind of challenge is that we continue to interact with, again, Vermonters or people who are here in Vermont, working for companies who just lack a very deep and nuanced understanding of US history. And I think that a documentary like the ones that you've just watched is a great way for people to, again, learn more about the history of our country in an accurate way. And again, this is something that, one would hope would change kind of materially, if you will, with each passing year, as more and more people have gone through either our pre-K-12 education system here in the country or have been educated other places in the world. But again, we just continue to see this really shallow, I would argue, and again, superficial understanding of US history. And we think that, obviously things would change dramatically if more of our young people across our country, where the vast majority of our young people are taught, were taught, right, the authentic truth about US history, acknowledging the good, but also, right, recognizing and learning the bad and the ugly as well. So one thing I just wanted to say in terms of the hope is that I do think that there is hope in that there are more and more and more organizations who are stepping up to the plate to engage in this work, and to engage in this work in a way that, frankly speaking, 20 years ago, when I was first going through the course, didn't even seem possible. To see and hear the words systemic racism in so many different sectors and at our highest levels of office, and again across many different parts of our society, it's heartening. And I think it's really important that the conversation is happening in so many different places. And I'll also just add, in response to that, we are also, I think, as some of you may know, we're seeing this vicious backlash against it as well. And I think it's really going to test us as Americans, as President Biden often said, that his kind of election and the election of him and Kamala were this battle for the soul of our country. There are going to be many more battles for the soul of our country in the days and months, in the years to come. And obviously, again, there's a lot more work for us to do there. So I'll leave things there and again, pass things back to you.
Thank you, Paul. We have a comment from a viewer, and this person is talking about the Black and Asian solidarity. Thank you, Li Ming, saying. She is saying, I'm assuming she is saying that there's the positive stories like the Black Panthers, Dr. Mutulu Shakur, Tupac's stepfather, using acupuncture in the 1970s and 80s to combat heroin addictions in the Bronx. So thank you, Li Ming. I also want to bring this conversation to the body. I'm, as a psychotherapist, I'm so aware of how we embody what it is that we're experiencing. And if we don't, how there can be such unconscious pain that actually drives us. There's an incredible quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates on this exact topic. And it says, but all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, and breaks teeth. So sorry, that is graphic. That is what we're talking about at the most extreme form. And it's true. He goes on to say, you must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body. And I think about that in terms of white-bodied people as well as people of the global majority, and how it is negative for all of us. Witnessing someone being bullied, generally, or othered, whether that's whoever the people are that are playing that out, to observe that or to have it happen to your own body is traumatizing. And how we all deserve the basic human rights of a sense of safety so that we can go deeper and feel that trauma, acknowledge that there's trauma there in our body as a trauma response. Now, that trauma response could be seeing someone be discriminated against and then mentally looking away. And that trauma response can also be walking into a store and, as someone who's brown bodied and me looking away, right? And depending on what day it is, I may be more or less able to be fully present. And so when I think about what I want, my hopes for our movement, our rainbow collective of everybody, all of us, is for all of us to be able to have that opportunity to have our basic human rights met so that we just have a chance to even get to the deeper stuff, beyond just the economics, the healthcare, the sense of not having a militarized system. So if we make a mistake, it doesn't need to be life or death. Mm-hmm. The ability to just take down the temperature a little bit for us and for the world, as much as we can offer to be a model, we need to get our stuff together.
Yeah.
and make deep changes, reparations. We need infrastructure for healing for all of us. So, you know, thank you, Li-Ming. You brought that into my mind, and yeah, just thinking about that, how much it means to me, that everyone feels safe in their bodies. So let's see. I think we have a question here from Sarah Rejoice Brown. Thank you, Sarah. She asks, could you talk a bit about what your personal experiences have been this past year as a result of increased anti-Asian racism during the pandemic? Thank you so much. Coco, would you like to go for it?
Yeah, I'm thinking of how to answer the question. Something that has really come up for me lately in working with other folks of color, specifically with Black colleagues as well. This has been a conversation that we've been, having and envisioning together, is how do we share our experiences without creating an opportunity for voyeurism, right? Like, how do we avoid the experience of being like, here's all my trauma, here's all the horrible things that have happened, or all the horrible things I've experienced, so that you can learn something. Because I think in so many ways, what I have struggled with this year in particular, just sort of to allude to your question, is the visibility of our pain and of our suffering and of our rage in a way that's never been before. And that's not a bad thing, right? Like, that's actually a productive, positive thing. I'm taking a course right now where we're talking about trauma as productive. And oftentimes we think about trauma as something that we have to heal, something that we have to fix, something that we have to attend to. And we don't really think about trauma as a sensical response to conditions that are being perpetuated by us, at us, around us. They're all encompassing, right? So trauma is actually this productive response to something that's happening, that our bodies and our hearts and our communities are saying, no, no, this is unsafe, this doesn't feel good, this isn't right, this isn't fair. And so when I think about sharing my personal experience, I think about the moments where I felt like I was walking through the world and so many things were going on. I think about the shooting in Atlanta. I think about the recent family in London, Ontario, that was killed, all but a child, right? And I'm sorry I didn't give a content warning there, but these are our stories. And to walk through the world, to navigate the world, and for people to look at you and say, how's it going? How are you? Great to see you, right? Like that, for me, there's just such a dissonance there. What it tells me is like, y'all don't know what's going on outside of this bubble, right? There's so much suffering and so much pain that's happening, not just at a local level, because we're all feeling the ripple effects, but at a statewide, nationwide, global level. It's a human level. We are at a time in the world of a major paradigm shift and a reckoning with, as you were saying, Puja, the harm that has been done to us, and that we've continued to perpetuate to us as well. So I think this year it's been a lot of dissonance. It's been a lot of feeling alone and feeling isolated and feeling like, why does no one know what's going on? Earlier today, I talked about the Patriot Act. I was in another class and someone said, can someone tell me what the Patriot Act was? And not a single person knew. Not a single person knew. And I'm sitting here thinking, that's a policy, that's a piece of legislature that totally changed my life. Totally changed my life, my family's life, and actually the whole country. But for some reason, I have just realized more deeply than ever this year that people don't know Asian history. People don't know that we've been here, that we are here, how we've contributed. People don't know the solidarity that we have been cultivating and really, striving to create. And I can't speak for all Asians, and I never will, but I can say, from this corner of the world, I have seen hard work, I have seen dedication, I have seen love and compassion. I want people to feel that. I want people to know that.
Awesome. Thank you, Coco.
Thanks.
And you, Paul, Is there anything that you want to share about your own personal experience this year?
Yeah, well, first of all, Sarah, thank you so much for joining tonight's session and for your question. It's great to see you in this way. I'll share two, I think, quick things. So in March, when the video of the beating of Vilma Curry, a 65-year-old Filipino-American woman in New York City, went viral, as I said, to me, the people who reached out to me first were my Black friends and Black colleagues. And I remember distinctly one colleague, Mike Hill, who basically said to me, "I'm here for you, brother, and I know how you might be feeling right now." Experiencing, what I think so many Americans were experiencing when they saw that brutal attack, it meant a lot to me, that he in this way would reach out, but also would reach out in a way to say, yeah, man, this is what, my community has been experiencing time and time and time again, and I'm going to be here for you. Just like you've had my back, I'll have your back. And I wanted to highlight that because, as bad as it has been and as traumatic as it has been, it has also been, a way for communities like ours to be able to come together in solidarity. The other thing I'll just quickly mention is that last March, when news broke out of a stabbing of a couple of young children and a father, I think at a Walmart in Texas, I was shook. Not only was I just, as a person, so anxious and unsure about what this pandemic was going to look like and feel like, seeing again and hearing about that particular attack, the perpetrator in this particular attack, was deliberately trying to harm this family because he thought that they were Chinese and he thought that they were spreading COVID-19. But the picture of, I believe, the younger of the two children that most news media outlets did not choose to share because it was so graphic and so gruesome was seared into my mind at that time. And I think that for me, I wasn't aware, at least at that time, of how tense and anxious I was, even walking around my neighborhood with my two children. At times, depending on the light, they might look a little bit more Asian than they, might not on a different kind of day with different lighting. But I just remember, not wanting to leave my house without some sort of protection, or making sure that I was as close to them as possible so that if somebody did walk by us and say something or spit in our faces or do something, that I would be there to protect them. And I think one of the hardest pieces for me as a parent was the reality that I might not be there to prevent something like that from happening to them. And the helplessness that I think I felt and so many others feel even now with my cousins in New York City, my elders in other parts of the country, just not or knowing, that we're not always going to be able to be there to stop something from happening. And sadly, these incidents have even picked up steam across our country. So that's a little bit of what my experience has been. And again, thank you so much, Sarah, for the question.
Thank you, Coco and Paul. We have another comment here. Let's see. This is from Sue Furman. Thank you, Sue. She says, our American history grew out of genocide, slavery, oppression of anyone who strays from that old party line, be it religion, race, gender, etc. And we need to remember that the first Americans were escaping their own oppression in Europe. So true. These very early Americans were traumatized, as you mentioned, Puja, and they passed it on to others. Yeah. I am so hopeful we have come as far as we have. We need to keep growing and talking and speaking our truths. Aho. Thank you, Sue. Appreciate that. Another comment question, I should say. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Paul. No? Okay. This is by Young Ki Kim. My apologies if I've mispronounced your name. Me and my wife are first generation Koreans working and living in Vermont, and we're wondering at what point our children who are US citizens become an American.
Mm.
Either of you guys have, particular?
Yeah. If it's okay, Coco, do you mind if I start?
Go for it.
So first of all, 처음 만나서 반갑습니다. That just translated into English just means, it's nice to kind of meet you for the first time. And I just said that in Korean. Technically speaking, right, if obviously, right, one is born here on, right, US soil, wherever that might be in the world, right, automatically they, by birthright, have the right to be American citizens. I think that the question, though, that you might be asking, and again, I'm obviously trying to infer here, is where does that kind of evolution or where does that transformation take place? And I think that what Coco, you talked about is something that I personally experienced as well, and actually, right, people like W.E.B. Du Bois talked about it for a long time. It's this double consciousness of not really being American, and in my case, and in your case, not really being Korean or South Asian or something along those lines. And I think that many people of color go through this, right, process of racial identity development where we just question, am I truly American or am I, right, something different? And some people, I think, at different times in their lives might feel more something or less something. And I think, again, that's part of that journey that so many of us go on, is to try to rediscover or to just discover that sense of self. And I think that, whether one's identity is really kind of robustly, if you will, connected to that ethnic identity, in your case, right, of Korean identity, I think, again, it remains to that individual to a degree, right, to decide. But again, I think just the simple short answer is there's the technical answer, and then there's the much more complicated, I think, individual answer that many people, right, go through sometimes, right, taking decades to try to answer for themselves.
Love that, Paul. Love that. Tough to follow that one up because I think that was all of it. But I will say, and I will add, I think just in addition to that idea of an individual exploration, there is the simple truth that you already are, right? They already are. There have been so many times in my life where I've asked myself that question, am I American enough? Am I American? Do I even want to identify as an American? And the truth is that I am, no matter what I think, feel, no matter what my experience is. That's the nature of being an American, is that we all are so different, that we all have different identities and backgrounds and experiences and relationship to our American identity. That is the American identity, is no similarities that can really just concrete or cement this idea of what an American is. So my hope to you, my wish for you is that you just kind of continue to pour that love into your child, into your children, everyone, to tell them that no matter how they feel, at whatever time it might be, that they always will belong here. And if they choose that this isn't their home or this isn't where they find belonging, that's okay. But this will always be a home. It will always belong to them.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Coco, and just want to second that your kids are supported by other people who have similar experiences, that they aren't alone, even if they're feeling alone sometimes. We have another comment here. This is again by Li Ming. I love this. Li Ming saying, I received a personal note from Peter Welch in solidarity and a promise that he would work with Rep. Grace Meng to support anti-Asian violence legislation. Woohoo. And then she writes, yes, I am she, her. Thank you, panelists. And a question. This is from Rolanda. Thank you, Rolanda. I'm a Filipino American, and oftentimes I get a question from people who are curious of my ethnicity. And I get the question, where are you from? Can you guys relate? And when I reply to their question that I'm from Montpelier, Vermont, they have that look, this look in their face like, where I came from, question mark, like another culture. Sorry if I'm reading that wrong. My question is, how do you answer that in a friendly manner and not get into an angry mode? Thank you, Rolanda.
Can I answer this or respond to this one first? So I love this question, and I'm going to complicate it with another question. Do we need to withhold our anger? Do we need to withhold our discomfort, our rage, our feelings of being wronged? I think that in a lot of ways, this is why a lot of Asian communities are where we are, is part of it's cultural, and part of it has been reinforced in the United States and like westernized culture, is that rage is not something that we can touch. Rage is not appropriate. Rage is not productive, right? And I want to just complicate this, because I think that, just for myself, historically, what I've noticed is a way that I've dealt with these kinds of micro traumas is a lot of intellectualizing and compartmentalization. And that's, been in many ways to create a learning moment or facilitate movement through the discussion rather than getting stuck and getting lodged in that feeling of hurt. And recently, what I really recognized was that is like a moment of performativity that we have to shield people from our anger, to shield people from our rage and our hurt. And so I think just shifting towards transparency, and a word I really like to use is being, not just authentic, but being raw authentic, right? How can we share that raw authenticity with others and not withhold it for the sake of keeping other people comfortable? So I know that wasn't a great answer to the question, but just something to chew on. Thank you.
Do you mind if I jump in here, Paul? So thank you, Coco, for talking about that right to rage. That right to rage, and that brings me to the right to violence. And in our society, in American society, we have outsourced the right to use violence to the police, to law enforcement. And that's where it's appropriate. That's where it's supposed to be appropriate. And thinking about, and also layer on here the intersection of being someone from the global minority and then global majority, and then also being female, being a woman, there's an expectation of softness, and there's an expectation of complicity. And so I think about just breaking that mold. I think about rage not being something that can necessarily be violent, but that actually a healthy expression of all of those emotions, like you had said, Coco, is so productive in allowing other people to also viscerally be healed from that experience of saying, okay, I said something a little bit off. Maybe I said, where are you from? And now this is awkward. And oh no, now the person's, they're looking, wait, if I pay attention, okay, what are they doing? Oh, wow. Okay, it makes sense. Kind of they're, I did kind of make an oops, no big deal, right? But now they've learned, and now it's off my chest. And I can breathe easy instead of walking away and being like, oh, damn, like, well, what was I supposed to, how was this? The whole walk away from that conversation that's uncomfortable. Did you want to add anything, Paul?
Yeah, I wanted to add a few quick things. One is I think that there's always the calculus, so to speak, of location that needs to be taken into account, and context as well. So if you're, in the grocery store, for example, and you ask that question, it's very different than if you're in a professional setting and your new supervisor, for example, is asking that question 2 or 3 times of you, or something to that effect. And so I do think that there is a strategy, if you will, a strategicness to being able to respond to a question like that in a tactful way. I also would kind of echo a little bit of what Coco was saying in the sense that I do think it is okay to also be vulnerable and to be able to say to the other person, what do you really mean with that right question? You've asked me that, 2, 3 times now. What would you really like to know is, probably the kind of end question. I think in most of those interactions, what they really want to know is what country, right, your ancestors have come from in order to do something to you, right, in order to locate you outside of what they believe to be, right, perhaps where you might belong. And so being able to be vulnerable with them and saying, I think I understand where that question might be coming from. I just want to tell you, it is really exhausting having to answer that question in that particular way. And again, a big part of my professional work also lies in trying to approach these conversations from a place of quote unquote being as centered as possible, where you're not letting your either, as Coco was saying, her kind of intellectual side or my emotional side or my action side or again, my belief side really taking over, if you will, and hijacking my response. But that, right, comes with practice. And I have to say that I have very deliberately tried to prepare myself for those types of questions and other types of situations so that I am ready to respond to them in a measured way. If you asked 19-year-old Paul how he would have responded to those, frankly, it might have been with this, right? And not with polite and kind of nice words. But there is a cost to it. And I'll just emphasize this as my last point for now, is that the cost, right, is me walking away and sometimes, right, lying awake at night and just thinking, did I say enough? Did I do enough? Was my response the best response I could have possibly given? And that toll, right, is something that I, right, internalize and carry with me. And I think that a lot of people of color, right, take that with them as well. As benign as that right question might seem to some people. So.
Thank you, Paul. So we actually have a comment here, and this is from Mary and Ray Chin. Thank you both. Paul, I agree with your comment about BIPOC people truly understanding each other and they are able to express it to each other. White people often don't know what to say to a BIPOC person about BIPOC suffering, similar to the anxiety at a funeral of what to say to a person whose family member died. The only thing worse than suffering is suffering alone. Belonging heals suffering. So thank you, Mary and Ray Chin. And Ben asks, I have in the past year or so started not using the term American to describe US citizens out of respect for Indigenous peoples in all of the Americas. As I watched the documentary and listened to the conversation, I wonder how Asian, quotes, Americans can avoid becoming part of the European settler colonialist project.
A good thought.
A good thought. Any immediate comments from you two?
I mean, one thing that, I don't know, Paul, if you feel comfortable, if I kind of bring it back to your role as a consultant too, but I think this sort of ties into this comment from Ben. Was it Ben?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I just have to say, like, as someone who used to be a DEI consultant for lots of predominantly white institutions, or PWIs as we call them, I left that field because I often felt as though, my mere existence in those spaces as a paid trainer and educator evoked this model minority myth that our communities are working so hard to disprove and dismantle. And sometimes I felt like people saw me as the palatable person of color, and people still see me that way, who was invested and therefore productive, not angry and therefore not counterproductive, right? And I have a close friend and a psychoanalytic colleague, Britt Go. We've often talked about Asian women as the ultimate vessel for projection. And as an Asian woman, it's my experience that people of all races, including other Asians, struggle to see me as multifaceted, as if I can't be invested and angry at the same time. And it's really hard to kind of hold all of that projection. And so when I think about, Asians falling into this pattern or this trap of being part of settler colonialism, I want to just redirect it a little bit, to just kind of acknowledge that we are existing within a larger system. And so, can I answer that question for all of Asians and how we can all avoid this trap that's been laid, with breadcrumbs for hundreds of years? Not necessarily. I don't necessarily have the answer to that. But I think in my experience individually, it is a choice that you wake up every day and make. So I love this perspective around the use of the term Americans. I haven't really thought of it that way before, but just to hear that and just to start talking about it, that's the conscious choice that I make, right? So I don't know if we can say how all Asians can avoid this, but I think as individuals, it's a question not just for Asians or Asian Americans, it's a question for all folks as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Coco. We have a comment here from Rolanda in response to what we were just talking about, that where are you from question. She writes, those are all great answers and thank you. Yes, it is, double underlined, so repetitious to answer those questions and to prove that you are an American as well. And I've learned to answer these questions with a sense of humor to it. That's awesome, Rolanda.
Awesome.
And a comment from Sue Furman. And to expand the harm you've experienced, we need to appreciate the harm humans have caused and endured over the ages to each other, to our planet, our waters, our brother and sister four-leggeds. It's big. We are connected to each other, to the planet, to the animals. As an aside, as a white woman, I have also felt like an outsider during the Reagan years, the Bush 1 and Bush first and junior and senior years, and especially the Trump years, when the religious right tell me I am wrong for believing whatever I do. 3 cheers for breaking the mold, for learning how to ask why without judging. Thanks for the discussion. Thank you, Sue. And then I think we'll take this one last question right here. This is from Marie V. How do you deal with or discharge the emotional labor or emotional toll of having to strategize each interaction? Paul, do you have a thought?
I have many thoughts, and it's Marie Vea. And again, Marie, thank you so much for joining tonight's program and for the question. I wanted to just quickly say something in response to Ben's question earlier as well. I just wanted to say it is an incredibly powerful question that you've asked, and it's a question that I personally, I think really need to spend some time to think about. And one thing I just wanted to share was a really challenging conversation that I had with one of my children recently about the privileges that we as Americans enjoy and really trying to contextualize that in a global context. And right, wanting, as Puja, you were saying earlier, for me, right, to be able to provide a safe and again, just intellectually stimulating environment to my child, but also acknowledging that there are literally, right, millions and millions and millions of other children out there in the world that are not, right, able to experience that kind of same level of safety or intellectual stimulation or something along those lines. But what I will say to you, Ben, is that I personally am going to think a lot about this question and try to, develop some sort of an answer that can speak to that. And I'll connect this a little bit to what Marie is asking, because for those of you who know me well, you'll know that I love science fiction and fantasy. And one of the reasons that I was drawn to the genre as a young boy was because it allowed me to escape some of the challenges I was experiencing as a young boy. And it just brought me to another world. One of the things that I seek again in that, and one of the reasons that I'm bringing this up right now, is because I also see in kind of that genre this glimpse of what humanity as a species could become like. And often it's kind of comes together or it coalesces together in response to some greater existential threat to our species, whether it's extraterrestrials, whether it's cataclysmic global climate change or something along those lines. And I wonder again if, if we have seen glimpses of what our species could be from the words, right, of these science fiction writers and just thinkers, and perhaps again, then there's something to that, at least in an answer from me to your question. And then for Marie, again, really leaning heavily, especially over the course of the past year, into that genre and trying to just imagine being on another part of the solar system or something like that. But honestly, I think for me as well, it's, I know this is, a very kind of simple answer, but just the basics of sleep hygiene, hydration, exercise, right? Things of that nature, to make sure that I'm trying to do everything that I can to be as kind of balanced as possible. So, all right, I'll leave it, to you, Coco.
Yeah, I love that. Oh my gosh, Paul, I totally resonate with the sci-fi. That's a big thing in our house as well. And I really, really, just the need to escape and to imagine a future that doesn't look like this, that looks like something that we deserve, right? Something that's deserving of us. That is really beautiful and necessary. And I'll also sort of tack on, part of my personal pedagogy with this is I've really actually moved away from doing a lot of the strategizing that you're talking about. So, in one-to-one interactions, in conversations, in spaces where I'm sharing space with people that may or may not agree with me, and things come up and things are hard, I'm just leaning into being transparent, right? And just naming like, wow, this feels really hard right now. I'm feeling a tightness in my throat like anybody else. I wonder what that's about. I wonder, why you asked that question. What was the reason for it? As Paul sort of alluded to as well, kind of being curious, right? And trying to lean away from the need to put a bow on it and make it easy, make it all better, or even just present it in a palatable way, like moving away from that palatability very intentionally to just show my humanity, right? I'm a complex person with feelings, with needs, with desires, with boundaries, with hopes and wishes and dreams, just like you, the person who's sitting across from me. And so, yes, this moment is feeling really hard, but can we stay in it together? And if we can't, if it's not feeling that way, just naming that, I feel like I can't continue being in this moment with you. I'd love to return at another time, or I'd be open to it, if we get to this certain place in our conversation at a later date, right? Like naming what I need to be there and naming what I need to go when I need to go. So I think for me, it's all about transparency. It's all about the vulnerability at the amount that feels right for you in the moment, to honor yourself, to honor your experience and your needs. I think that's really important. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
So with that, we'll have to honor the parting of us from you all. Thank you, Coco, and thank you, Paul, for being here and taking the time and the energy. And thank you, everyone, for engaging with us. We really appreciate it. This conversation will be archived on the Vermont PBS YouTube channel, so you can access it and you can share it later on. And we invite you to view the whole full Asian American series. It's 5 parts. So that was just the 5th part, on pbs.org. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.